Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting. I am delighted to be bringing to you today 2 amazing women, Michelle Acciavatti and Krystina Friedlander. Michelle is a funeral director and an end-of-life specialist, which includes also being a death doula, and she has been recently in mortuary school. And Krystina is a licensed midwife in New Jersey, a herbalist, and a childbirth specialist with a home practice. Both of them are working in this liminal space of what does it mean in the primary sacraments of our lives, of coming into the world and leaving it. And they have been friends for over 8 years, and it is my pleasure to be bringing their voices, their insights, and their wisdom into your lives. And we hope that this conversation at the time of COVID-19 is going to be, I know it's going to be very, very rich. And I also just want to acknowledge in this conversation that the topics that we're talking about, life and death, and a changing world around both life and death, birth and death, this is a conversation that it's going to elicit like some challenging moments. And I just want to tell us, our listeners, that it is completely like we're going to take time to breathe, and we encourage you to take time to breathe. And we totally acknowledge the challenges of some of these conversations. And we're also going to try to make sure to take some time to laugh. And as I invite them to come on and share with us, I just want to take a quick moment to give a thanks of gratitude and to have a brief prayer. I'm going to invite everyone to just take a deep breath and to come here now into this moment, away from whatever you were doing before, and to listen with your feet in the ground, to listen with your hands and your hearts, to hear with that deeper part of yourself that is always filled with wisdom, always bubbling with curiosity, that is guided by our ancestors and our spirits By the indigenous people, we give thanks for the landscape upon which we are living, for the food, for the water, for the light, and for the air. May the energy that we share here be for the benefit of past, present, and future beings. So, Krystina, would you like to start and share with us? Tell us a little bit what you're doing, because I introduced you as a midwife, but you're both specialists in your field and in what you do. And you can explain to us, our audience, a little bit more about what you're actually doing. That would be very helpful.
Sure. So, as a home birth midwife, well, let me kind of go back a little bit, because I started off as a birth worker, as a childbirth doula about 10 years ago. And as a childbirth doula, I was accompanying people, really companioning people through the process of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And I saw, my role was very much as companion, providing education, holding space for people to feel all the things that come up, providing space to have the conversations that they needed to have, and preparing them for birth, and then companioning them through birth, and then through the postpartum as well. And then I became a midwife. I started attending home births about 5 or 6 years ago. I had my daughter at home almost 6 years ago, and then finished my education and became licensed about 1.5 years ago, a little bit more than that. So I've been practicing since then. And the model of care that I operate within is pretty different from what most people experience in the United States and right now in most of certainly in the West. And that model is one of, again, companionship, and also proximity and intimacy in the process of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And when I see people, I usually sit with them for about an hour at least in appointments. We really get to know one another. And I have a lot of respect for the vulnerability of birth, the intimacy of birth, and the fact that people, bring me into their space, the space of their home, is really an honor, and it's very humbling. And to be able to touch their bodies is an honor, and it's humbling. And to be able to receive their babies is an honor, and it's humbling. And I have to kind of remain in that. That's kind of what keeps me in this profession, what marks me, in a sense, in this profession. So what that looks like typically under normal circumstances is that I'm seeing them throughout their pregnancy, and then seeing them with increasing frequency. And I do, a lot of the same stuff that people receive in kind of conventional, I won't call it traditional because I don't think of it as traditional, but conventional medical practice, in that, I perform their lab work, and I'm taking their vitals, and I'm checking their baby's position and all of that. But the difference is that, it's not rushed. I mean, it's that foundation of a relationship is so important, because then going into birth, it's that foundation that we are resting upon. And it facilitates the kind of trusting relationship that people need to have which I believe they need to have with their provider. I develop friendships with a lot of my clients because of that intimacy and vulnerability. So now, what that looks like, it's a question of how do I preserve that model of care as more and more of my contact with my clients is moving into telemedicine. And then when I am sitting with them in person, preserving that intimacy behind masks and behind, gloves, and distancing myself from their bodies. And then at births, being very, I know, like in my heart, I feel so much more hesitancy and caution around touching people, not only, for my safety, but for theirs. And remembering that, like, one of the ways that I'm showing care for my clients right now is actually not being as intimate and hands-on as I normally would be. Yeah, so I mean, there are so many changes, and I think we'll get into that in the conversation. But I just wanted to give that kind of overview of what I do.
Thank you. Thank you. Like, there's a lot I heard there, particularly how important honoring and humbling is for you in your practice. And I thank you for sharing that. Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and a tiny bit about what's changed, and we'll kind of go deeper into that.
Yeah. As I was listening to Krystina talk, I was thinking about, like, one of the things that's never been quite clear to me is that in working in death, and I'll talk a little bit about my story, is that I serve two different clients in a way, intimately related but different. I serve the person who has died and their body and the physical needs of their body, but also then their loved ones, the emotional and physical needs of their loved ones. And I've never actually, it's just sort of this moment of realizing when I'm being of service, it's of to two different people. So I mean, I guess like the over term for what I would call myself is a death worker. I'm working mainly under sort of the more restricted category of funeral director. So meeting with people for the most part when someone has died, and guiding them, companioning them, being there for them through that process of deciding what to do and how to design ritual and ceremony and make decisions about the disposition of their loved one's body. And then concurrent with that practices, and also I'm the person that is removing their loved one's body from the place that the death has occurred, and generally back to the funeral home, and then facilitating whatever sort of interaction needs to happen between the people who are living and this body that is, what is left of this person that is loved on this earth, and also ceremony and ritual, and again, using a lot of usually very intimate, sitting close with people in order to listen to what they're really saying and what their needs are. Death is so scary. For most people, we tend not to think about it. The number of people that sit down across from me and say, I have no idea what I'm doing. And so starting from this place of complete not knowing and fear, and guiding people into a sense of feeling as though they can confidently make a decision about what they need to do, and not projecting any of my own sort of ideas, and just being very, very present for them. And yes, again, really struggling with that change of how do I do that with a mask? How do I do that when I can't touch? Or maybe it's safer for everybody if I'm not touching. And just, so the limits in communication, and how I got to this point was I have a background in neuroscience and ethics, and Krystina was absolutely my eureka moment in this, as I was working at Boston Children's Hospital, and with the Office of Ethics there, and dealing with a lot of decisions about end of life for children, and just talking about how there had to be a better way. And Krystina was like, you should be a death midwife. Literally, this is how it happened. We were sitting at her table in her apartment, and I didn't know what that was. And so she kind of gave a little bit of a rundown about it. And I knew a lot sort of like of her thinking about midwifery and being a doula. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but it definitely shaped my thinking. And so it sort of put me on this path of how do I come into relationship with families, and how do I help people, maybe even before death, ideally, to start to come into a different type of relationship with mortality, where we acknowledge it as something that is a part of our lives every day. And we I don't necessarily want to say enter into a friendship into it, but like into a relationship with our own mortality. And so that took a lot of different forms from that eureka moment, and it's ended up being a funeral director, but it looked like working on how to help people sort of plan and prepare for their own death. What would it mean for people to live well through death? So, dying is a process, and it's not just something that happens out of nowhere. And so how to create that path for people. So working with advanced directives, working with actually kind of getting people more integrated with the existing systems that are there, like hospice, but also helping people get the support that they need, and put plans into place for what would it look like to be at home. Really looking at, why does death need to be professionalized or medicalized? I mean, medical support is sometimes very helpful, but and helping people become more open to the broad array of ways that you can live your own death and dying. And then also what happens after that, and what happens to the body, and how do we really truly honor this body that is, has homed somebody that was loved, that lived this incredible life, and that body is what allowed that life to take place. And so how do we really honor that, and come into relationship also with the body, not as something that needs to be scared of, or something that needs to just be put away or not thought about. And that's the other thing that's hard for me, particularly right now, because for the most part, dead bodies are not dangerous. And with COVID-19, there is a small risk within a window of time for transmission from the body to the person. And so it's changing the way that I interact with the body, and that I do have to treat it a little bit more like an object than I would like to, because I do have to disinfect it. And that comes up in other ways of my work too, that there are times when my relationship with the body is more, has to walk this line between object and person. But it's particularly present for me right now. So that's sort of how I got to where I'm at, and where I am, and really trying to push the boundaries and explore how, in this age where we are currently under so many social restrictions, and how we come together and how we gather. Because one thing that's so important with grief is being seen and being held in community. And so how do we adapt and find community in new ways? Because I feel like, especially within the funeral director profession, it's been a lot about like, let's just do this online. And I don't think that necessarily, so I'm thinking very, very deeply about what are the needs of grieving, and how do we meet them? And so really trying to connect back to the very, very basic elements of death and dying, and leaving this world, as opposed to sort of the more conventional things that are in place in terms of body care and disposition, and the more ritualized aspects of funeral and celebration like that. Yeah.
So much that both of you have said that's like really, really beautiful. And just like this huge question of how do we deal with our bodies, and what is intimacy, and what is ceremony, and what is gathering in a time when we're told not to gather, and how do we deal with gathering when bodies are the subject matter. It's one thing when you're talking about education or something else, but when you're actually talking about the human body and the transition between life and from one world, from one we might think, from one world to another world, usually referred to as a spiritual world to the physical world, but I don't want to have quite that terminology on it. But just thinking about that particular moment, right? That particular transition from one to another, which both of you guys are working on very much. I'm wondering if you can, how do you talk about that? Like, and what is this word doula? Like, what does that really mean?
I have a story actually that has a Michelle story that I think really touches on this. So I was working at a birth center in New Hampshire, and Michelle was coming to visit me, and she was taking the bus to the bus station in Concord, New Hampshire, and I was going to pick her up. And so I was at work in Concord, and we found out we had a mom coming in, and it was her first baby. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go pick up Michelle, and then I'm going to drive her back 45 minutes to where I live. I'm going to drop her off, and then I'll drive back to the birth center because this mom's, she's going to be in labor for a while, and that's great. So I go in, I pick up Michelle, found out, okay, the mom's on her way in. I'll go, and I was an advanced student at the time, so it was kind of my responsibility to kind of welcome her and do the thing. So I was checking how dilated her cervix was, and I was like, oh, the baby's right there. So Michelle was sitting in the waiting room of this very small, beautiful, intimate space that is this little birth center, and the mom's in the birthing room, and the midwives and I are in the birthing room, And so I didn't even have time to go out and tell Michelle in the waiting room, like, oh, by the way, I can't drive you home. We're just gonna have to wait here for a while, because it was happening. So the mom's pushing, and I received the baby, and, you know, we did all the sort of postpartum things. And then I finally had a chance to come out into the waiting room and see Michelle and talk to her and let her know, like, oh, sorry. And she was sitting there with tears streaming down her face. And maybe Michelle can just say a little bit about what it was like for her in that moment of being able to hear somebody give birth, which is, you know, our work complements one another's work like so beautifully, because there are deep parallels in what we do. And as she's talking about, you know, what her work, I'm just like of course I'm taking all these notes, because it's the same thing. It's so much of it is the same, and how we feel about it is the same, and the kind of honoring work is the same, but there is something that is very different about what we do. So Michelle, you can kind of talk about what that moment was like for you.
I also want to add that when you came out, you were carrying a placenta.
Oh yeah, because I had gotten permission from the mom to show you her placenta.
And I was. It was just part of it. I'm like, I physically can't have children, and I love them. So it was just this like profound sense of privilege of being in the space. I mean, obviously not in the room, but hearing like a new human enter into this world. And it was just this incredibly profound experience. And it just it was this beautiful birth center. I mean, I think that helped create this atmosphere, because it was like this being in this most sacred moment that I could think of, where just like there was this like just this hush, and the only sound was sort of the sound of the labor. And then all of a sudden there was this new voice, and it was just like this realization that voice had never been heard before, and to get to be one of the people that heard that sound for the first time it was ever me. I'm tearing up all over again. It was so incredible, because usually when I'm sitting in that liminal space, and death is very much a kind of labor. And as a funeral director, I don't get to sit with people who are dying anymore, but I did when I was a death doula, and I would sit with them as they were dying. And, you know, there's so many parallels, the breathing, and like we're thinking about the similar things of how is the breathing happening. And so one of the teachers that Krystina and I have in common is woman Amy Wright Glenn, and she makes the point that the first thing that we do when we're born is we inhale, and the last thing that we do when we die is we exhale. So to be present for the inhale, and then the sound that comes with that exhale was incredible, because so much of when I'm in that space is to wait for that exhale, which is followed by this incredible stillness. There is a profound stillness that comes with death. The body doesn't like tick as it cools down like an engine. When you turn an engine off, it just stops. And so I'm used to, when I'm sitting in this space of transition, entering into this space of very profound stillness and quiet. And so to have the privilege of being in that space of transition and having that be a space where there is sound. And there wasn't like a hurried busyness, but there were things that you were doing, you know, that, and voices, and just this feeling of like joy and wonder and awe. And not that those feelings aren't always present at death. But it was so incredible. Yeah. And then, yes, and you came out and you had this placenta in your hand, which was also incredible, because it's this amazing thing that our bodies do is to grow this whole new organ just for the baby. And the mom was just incredibly generous also with just allowing me to just sort of like look at all of that and then just be like, wow. Like, and I think I even said, I was like, there's a new human. Like, So that I think, that was what that experience was for me. And it draws so much on the parallels of, it is this sacred transition, and that we witness in a lot of ways. And it's really being present and letting the moment happen as much as possible, more than any sort of action. So a lot of when I think about like your question, like, what does it mean to be a doula? in this way. You know, a lot of my thinking is shaped by my friendship with Krystina, because so many of these terms came first from conversations with her, and when she was exploring transitioning into like a full midwifery practice, and being able to, you know, she's a little bit ahead of me on the path and kind of choosing how I wanted to be present for that at a different transition. A lot of that is just that sense of just being able to be present, and allow whatever is going to happen in that moment to happen. And obviously have a whole bunch of tools for things that happen when the unexpected happens in that moment, but to mainly just be present. And so that was an enormous benefit to my practice too, because I'm sitting in a waiting room. There's absolutely nothing, well, kind of the entryway living room space of that. There was nothing I could do but sit and listen and be present in that moment. And so it was this incredible teachable moment for me too, in terms of like, oh, like this is what it means to just really drop in and be here.
I hear so much in both of what you guys are saying about the importance of presence during transition. And I'm wondering, Krystina, like, how would you define doula? You're muted.
So I think there's the definition that you could get off of, you know, like an organization, a doula organization website, which is somebody who is someone who holds space, who accompanies parents through this process, who educates and advocates for people. And I think that all of those things are true, you know, providing physical touch and emotional support during labor. You know, I think probably one of the most common questions I get is, well, what's the difference between a doula and a midwife? And, you know, a doula is a non-medical support person, essentially, who is not making any sort of diagnostic calls, is not providing care for people in that way, is not, you know, monitoring, is not making decisions about their care, but is really there to companion through the experience and make sure, you know, when I'm in my sort of like doula role for people, and I do have one doula client right now, and I can talk about how that has changed, because that's been pretty profound. You know, I'm there to provide kind of like education, support, advocacy, validation of their choices, validation of their feelings, you know, making sure when I'm at a birth that they understand what's happening, or that they understand what's being, you know, said to them or explained to them, if it's being explained at all. You know, things are not always explained clearly or with language that parents understand, because they're not familiar with the medical language. So doing some kind of like translation, and then making sure that that translation goes the other way, and making sure that the parents' desires are also heard, and making sure that they have room for self-advocacy. And all of that has to be done in this sort of like diplomatic way. And I've been in all kinds of different situations in my doula work. And then in terms of how that shifted, you know, doulas are now currently, for the most part, certainly in my area in New Jersey and in New York, you know, we're not allowed into the birth room anymore. We're not allowed into the hospital anymore unless a parent, it brings us in lieu of another person. So if they're partnered, you know, and they want their partner with them, then they're not going to have their doula with them. Some people are choosing their doula to come with them instead of their partner, because they feel like that's the support that they need. So things have really changed around that, and doulas have moved to doing telephone and video support. And then a lot of our work is, you know, now talking about, you know, doing even more of the education ahead of time, and resourcing people ahead of time, so that they can go into their births with more of the knowledge that I would have otherwise brought to them in as like different situations or contexts emerged. You know, so kind of preparing people for more of like the field of possibilities. So that's and that's been one of my roles as a doula is really to do like a lot of hands-on support during labor. And it's been very challenging to not be able to provide that. I've had 2 doula clients now have their babies, and they both had their babies right around when hospitals were first issuing the policies about not having a second support person or a support person there, because I'm also supporting the partner when I'm with partnered clients. I'm also helping them. So, that was really challenging to figure out. There's also, I'll say that there has been such a huge demand for home birth midwifery as a result of the pandemic. And people who were on the fence about home birth before, people who, sometimes I have clients who say, well, I'd love to have a home birth, but I'm going to have a hospital birth for my first baby. And then my second, I'll think about home birth. A lot of those people are now saying like, actually the hospital doesn't feel like a safe place anymore. Going to doctor's offices doesn't feel safe anymore. So people's assessment about safety and risk has really shifted. And that gets into, a much larger conversation about medicine and health and where all of that is going. But yeah, so you had just asked about what it means to be a doula.
But I have to say, because like this is also something that's happening in death, because I think one of the things that people are realizing that like right now, if you're choosing to go to the hospital to get treated for COVID-19 or for anything, I mean, if you break a leg and you end up in the hospital, you are ending up in isolation. Your family can't come with you to the hospital. And so the magnitude and the difficulty of the choices that people are having to make, for me, I can speak a little bit to that choice of potentially dying. And there's parallels between people that want to die at home and are prepared and always ready for that, and then some people that are like well, that conventional dying experience involves a lot of medical care and support, and when we're sick we go to the hospital and that's what we do. And so a lot of people that are kind of in that transition space are saying, oh no, because I don't want to die alone or potentially die alone, so I am going to stay home. And it's a little bit hard for me because I'm on the fence again now as a funeral director. I'm not in a position to be serving those people, but I worry some about, there are also people that are making that choice completely out of fear and are a little unprepared for the reality of what it means to die at home and the support that you need, and what your caretakers need and how they're all going to be supported. And so I know that in a lot of death doula communities and home funeral or community family-led funeral communities, for caring for the bodies, there's these conversations about how do we work with these people that were never prepared for it and hadn't thought about it ahead of time. So like there's just such a parallel.
I have to like just so many parallels. Yeah, because it's the same thing. We have a lot of people, there are a lot of people who were open to the idea of home birth before, and so they have a smoother transition into midwifery care than the people who are terrified of going to the hospital right now. And it's not just because they can't have a doula. People are afraid of contagion. They are also afraid that they will be separated from their babies, because right now, if you have any symptoms of the virus, what they're doing is they're isolating babies for 2 weeks after they're born. And I don't know how uniform that policy is. And because I've also seen images of people who, like mothers and people having their babies wearing face masks or wearing face shields, and then nursing their babies, and it's,
so that sounds that sounds terrible to me. Is that terrible? Am I correct?
It's so terrible. It is so traumatic. What is happening right now, I think, is so deeply traumatizing, whether we're talking about birth or death. Right. And because I think what's happening is like already, and Michelle and I both, often speak about this with one another, already the system is stacked against the human experience, the mammal experience. And, that's not to say that people can't have a good birth or a good death in those medicalized spaces. And for a lot of people, if that's their expectation and that's where they feel the most safe and they feel the most cared for, then that's going to be the appropriate place for them to be. But there are a lot of people who, even under normal circumstances, walk away from those experiences with a lot of trauma. And that, you know, especially if you are African American or a person of color, an indigenous person, you know, then like there are other things that come into play. But what I hear in this conversation is sort of like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human and have a baby? What does it mean to be human and die? And what are the experiences that most honor our being? And what are the experiences that most strip away from that? You know, and I mean, I have clients right now who, you know, if I have to transfer to the hospital and someone tells me I can't be with my partner and my baby, like I'll get arrested because I refuse to allow that. I have another, you know, we know somebody else who said, if my husband is in the hospital dying, like there's no way I'm not going to be by his side. You know, there's something that is so fiercely human that people are trying to protect. And that we haven't figured out how to hold or protect that space necessarily. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I know a lot of nurses who are working so hard to preserve the dignity of their patients. And doctors, same thing, you know, I really deeply honor and respect that. But what I think that this has unveiled, you know, certainly not for me or for Michelle, who have seen it and who've built careers and vocations that are in contrast to this problematic system. But what it's doing is it unveils those deeper problems for a lot more people, which is a good thing because we want it to change.
Maybe not this way though.
Not this way. This wasn't what we were hoping for.
What we were hoping for.
This isn't what anyone was hoping for. And so part of what I'm really hearing from you guys in this question, this profound question that is raising, what does it mean to be human, to be mammals, right? And the experience of the animalness of our bodies as we are on a spiritual journey, I hear both the importance of the pre-thinking of the experience, like the thoughts you have about birth and death before you get there, and the conceptions, the visions, the ideas. But the other piece of this, which may or may not be part of people's pre-thinking, is that for millennia, like both birth and death is a communal experience. That we don't either come into this world or leave this world. Like to do it well is often not to do it alone, and not to say that there aren't traditions that do focus on doing it alone, but that actually sometimes takes more preparation. To die alone well is its own. People prepare for years to do that within certain religious traditions. But so this both the vision and the communal aspect of it feel like very important in terms of how humans have learned to be humans. Am I understanding that correctly?
I mean, I would absolutely, say so. And I think that it's, you know, we live in community, and for me too, it extends into what, you know, the grieving and the, you know, right, and mourning practices. All of those things are built around community. And I think that, you know, Krystina can speak to also like the post-birth experience, like, and a lot of postpartum support, like all of that is meant to take place in community. And so there is a very communal aspect to what it means to be an embodied and empowered human through these experiences. And that's sort of where my thinking that's where like I'm running into. So how do we have community when we can't like have literal togetherness? How do we create a sense of togetherness?
Especially when you're talking about bodies and part of what I get from you guys is Michelle, you touched on this, but also Krystina, is how much communication you're doing through physical touch, and how much you're conveying through physical presence and physical touch that might be very gentle or might be like pronounced. And I'm wondering if you can like speak to how is that touch supporting us? Because I think in order to answer these questions, we have to go quite deeply into what the thing itself is. We have to go quite deeply into what is actually happening in these moments in order to understand how we can create quote unquote solutions or responses for this moment. So like what are we really conveying? What's happening in these nonverbal moments?
Somebody was just asking me why touch is important to a funeral director. And what came to me is that the language that people are primarily expressing grief through, and like dying itself is a physical process, right? And I mean, obviously there's emotional processes, but the language that those emotions are getting expressed through, the grief when people come to me is often very, very physical. The crying, the sounds that are made, the vocalization, the way people hold their bodies wrapped around themselves. It's this physical communication of what they're actually feeling. And to me, it makes sense to respond to how something is being communicated in the same language. So to communicate back in physical language is a way to meet somebody at that place. I think that when you write through that cliche of words are inadequate, why are words inadequate, right? And words start to give shape and meaning, and in a lot of ways limit what it is that someone is feeling, and that physical expression, if we can continue to communicate with each other in that same physical language, is much less limited, much more intimate, and there's just fewer barriers and limits to it. So my instinct is always to respond when I see somebody communicating physically in a physical language, and maybe not to like literally go and wrap my arms around them when they're making themselves small, but to acknowledge that I see them making themselves small, and even just a small gesture in kind. So that to me is why it's just so important.
And I think that what I can add to that is that birth itself and labor itself are things that happen in the body that activate parts of the brain that are not the language parts, that are not the problem solving and processing parts of the brain. And so the more language and the more speech that is used in labor, depending on what part of labor people are in, the more distracting or unhelpful it can be for somebody who is going deeper and deeper and deeper into their process. So it is not helpful for me to ask a lot of questions or to talk to them. I don't, the way that I use language in labor is maybe I'll say something like just one word. I'll say, soften or strong or, something like that, where I'm dropping the word or the feeling into their consciousness, but I'm not expecting a response. And I'm certainly not, every once in a while people labor and we have like whole conversations in labor, and that's what they want. But, that certainly wasn't my experience, and it's not the experience that I typically see. So just being physically present, and, oftentimes people have their eyes closed or they have their face turned away. And so marking that presence with touch is important to ground people. Oftentimes I'll just like touch someone's shoulder and say, soft, reminding them to keep their body soft. So those are the kinds of things that, I don't know necessarily how to adapt to. That said, the midwife one of the midwives that I trained with and who was my midwife, she was the sort of person who would sit quietly on the other side of the room so that a person or a couple could move through the process themselves, and they could look up and they could just see that she was there. And that was what they needed. And so, I also have to remember that sometimes I do need to be in the action or in the process with people. And then other times it's their experience, and it's their, whether it's them going through it as an individual or them going through it as a couple or other kinds of family constellations, or children being there or animals being there. And so for me to insert myself into that experience is sometimes inappropriate.
There's this sense of like being able to project presence without language. You know, we put such a big deal on language as a community. We really encourage it in children when children develop language. And I think that it can be a way of separating, and it certainly can take people out of the moment. And for me, one of these ideas of that, like, well, we still have the internet, is that I just don't think that you can project presence in the same way over a screen. You know, I mean, it's, or it's just it's gonna somehow be very different over it. I don't want to say cannot, like, I don't want to limit, I don't want to take away the possibility that exists here, but I just think that there's more to it than just saying, okay, I'm going to be on this side of the screen and you're going to be on the other side of the screen, and I'm just going to be feeling at you through this tiny little lens on the top of my computer, and you're going to be able to feel that. Again, there's that kind of like going back to that sense of like pre-preparing, and like kind of what is it going to mean for the fact that I'm going to be on the other side of the screen. And, you know, and for me, some of that is working with families who are grieving that of course want to hug and be held, and to start talking to them about what is that going to look like when they can't hug and be held, or someone that's supporting that somebody that's grieving and all they want to do is just go and sit and be present with somebody. And, you know, so to talk about interacting even through screens and change, like, so maintaining eye contact instead of looking at the picture, like someone through the video, like really looking at the camera, gesture, like going, you know, holding yourself in the gesture of a hug or something. And then when we are using language, like really the tone of our voice like really has to matter so completely. For me, I find it so much more exhausting to be working with families in this way, because it's like I can't afford to let my mind wander at all. Like I have to be like just really drilled in, and like, and especially if I'm masked, I mean, it's really just my eyes and like the tilt of my head that, and some of my gestures that they're going to get. And so how do I get that to convey all these things that I'm used to being able to convey in so many other ways? It's just such a struggle. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. Really easy.
Yeah. So without trying to go too quickly into solutions, but just like really being with this understanding that so much of what we convey to each other in these transitions is profound, some of the most profound and most mysterious transitions that we know of birth and death. And some of the very few places that everyone shares in common. Just the profundity of what you have both said, of speaking towards these two transitional moments are moments when we're not in our rational mind. This is not about whatever logic we have created for ourselves before, during, or after our lives and our communities. It's that there is something, that the profundity that's happening in this moment cannot be fully communicated, which might be why I'm struggling to find the right words for it right now. And the mystery of these moments is one that we have for millennia been present for each other for. And that is what we instinctively desire and what we want, and what many people such as yourselves have trained for years and years to be able to bring to the people who you work with, is a quality of presence as well as a deep knowledge of a space that most of us don't know very much about. And I would actually, I mean, obviously we talk very little in the society about death, and I would also say we don't often know that much about birth either. We don't avoid it in the same way that we avoid talking about death, but certainly it's also quite mysterious for most of us. And there's
not only that,
yeah, go ahead.
but it's, you know, people have a lot of deep, profound fears of birth, just as they have deep, profound fears of death, which is a function of the culture that we live in. It's not, you know, it's not inherent to being human to fear either birth or death. both have been moved into these, you know, largely invisible spaces. And oftentimes I know with birth, at least, you know, we haven't created spaces that honor that transition to, you know, having a baby, being, you know, having a body that grows and births and then nourishes a new human is not something that's honored in our culture here in the United States, or at least in the dominant culture in the United States, you know, which is a function of a particular kind of history that we have, a colonial history. And, you know, my background is in anthropology. And so I know that's not true. That's not true of everybody. And it's not true of everybody living in the United States. So, where was I going with that? I can't remember what prompted me to say that.
But you're just reaffirming that birth is not talked about very much.
Oh, right.
You don't understand it.
Yeah. So there, you know, and so when people have, many people have traumatic experiences of medicalized birth, and some people have traumatic experiences in out of hospital settings as well. But you know, there's an anthropologist who talked to people who were in their 70s and asked them to remember their birth experiences, and they very, very clearly could remember, and whether or not they felt positively or negatively about their birth was solely connected to how they felt cared for, which I think is really important. And so when people describe these traumatic experiences, and oftentimes, you know, the story ends with, and then the doctor saved my life, or something like that. The system was there to catch me. People don't necessarily see how the system produced the situation, or the kinds of decisions that their care provider made, which are decisions that are not necessarily made with somebody. I will say not necessarily. They're not made with an individual's desires in mind. They're oftentimes, you know, shaped by issues around liability or hospital protocol, or the conventional practice. Things like, you know, things that are also invisible in the process that people don't necessarily see. The way that people are treated as you know, these uniform populations, as opposed to individuals who have individual desires and individual relationships and cultures and family cultures and all of these things. So, you know, I think that's where so much of that trauma comes in, and how that trauma is then communicated to other people, which then continues to feed into cultures of fear around birth and death.
I think it's one of these things where we often talk about things without actually talking about them. Like when we talk about birth, like, you know, it's like, oh, and then there was a baby, you know, and like we dismiss the whole experience, like from conception and growing through. And so many women have very, very different relationships to their bodies as they're pregnant. Not everybody feels like this wonderful earth mama that's, you know, like this wonderful and sustained. And, you know, it's the same with dying. I mean, there are some people that are just really ready, even when they're young, but or, you know, like kind of not necessarily we think about the transition to death happening, that are really ready to kind of embrace this and live this. And then there are other people that have ambiguous relationships with the fact that they're dying in their bodies through the dying process. And then, you know, so after death, people have very ambiguous relationships with what happens to the body after death. And, you know, so we talk about all these things without ever actually talking about them. You know, we label birth, we label death as if they're these like little moments in time that just happen. And then there's a baby, and then there's a dead body. And then there's the things that happen, but we don't talk about embodying that process. And I think that's why we end up with like the fear and just how it continues to be so possible in our culture, where like, yes, the two things that absolutely everybody has in common is that you're born and that you die. And yet somehow in our US American culture, especially, like those are just the two things that we just don't think about happening. We don't think about what, you know, we don't think about how, we don't think about any of that. And then it comes and it's like, oh, I have to deal with this now. And it is very easy to want to give that to somebody that wears this title of professional. And so part of, you know, as somebody that and Krystina, I know that like when you were talking about licensed versus unlicensed, right? This is which is a whole other conversation. But as a funeral director, right, I have this title of professional. People are coming to me because I am supposed to know exactly what they're supposed to do when somebody has died. And, there are things that I do know, but a lot of that work is like, how do I kind of deconstruct that role into giving that back to the family and really having them. And I think that the way that this comes up the most clearly is like, I also am a big advocate for green burials. And people love to come out and everybody loves to talk about green burial. Everybody loves the idea of the body returning naturally to the earth and sustaining the ecosystem and this whole cycle of things. And I've learned that when I give these talks, I have to start out by saying, but we are going to be talking about dead bodies. And you're probably going to end up then thinking about dying and maybe someone you love dying and maybe your own self dying. And this is going to be hard. And I literally had somebody tell me that that's a terrible thing to say. Because they want to just talk about the environmental aspects of it. And it's like, you can't have a green burial without a dead body. You can't have a dead body without somebody dying. Like it's just, the disconnects there are so real. And so people come in to plan a funeral and I want to start talking to them about, okay, well, what really matters to you in this moment? And they might go into, oh, well, they're Catholic, so we're going to have a mass. And it's like, okay, like, absolutely. Like, but why? And what do you need? And tell me about the dying experience and like, all these things. And it's just, there are some families that aren't ready to go there, and it's very much, I have to kind of judge, is a family going to want to walk in that direction or not? But if they do, that, people think that they're just going to come down and make a decision. Okay, we're going to have cremation, we're going to have a mass, we're going to do these things. And instead we're ending up having a conversation about the dying, about the person, about what their body meant to them, about what it means to honor their body. And it starts out very difficult, but like then the weight that comes off of people when I'm able to take them to that place is just amazing, because I think that, again, they lock up and they hold because they don't want to think about it because it's scary, and it's almost some ways wrong. Death is a failure in US American culture. I mean, you can be 107 and die and it's still somehow a bad thing. It's just bizarre to me. So I really try really hard to bring these things to actually talk about what it is that we're talking about, and if people are ready to move them out of that prescribed space and into down into what's actually happening.
So we are
where I see that in my work also is just like this sense of the purpose of birth being about having a healthy baby, like healthy birthing person, healthy baby. And very quickly getting to that foundation of like, just so you know, like we're all talking about at the baseline, like, of course, that's what we want, whether you have your baby at home, whether you have your baby in the hospital. And sometimes that's a very good reason why you shouldn't have your baby at home, because you're in a higher risk situation, and it's more appropriate to have your baby in the hospital where you have the most appropriate kind of care. But what you said about like, there's so much more than just having a healthy baby. There is that transition, there is that introspection, there is the physical transformation, and also thinking about not just for people who identify as, but also people who identify in other ways, people who have very different relationships to their bodies in pregnancy, because that's not how they typically experience their bodies. So I think that my role and your role is to ask people about what are these other things that matter that you may not have been told matter, that are inconvenient in medical spaces, that are inconvenient in a capitalist society.
Mm-hmm. And we're now in a situation where everything you guys have said seems to be even more so that it seems as if it's been exacerbated, the sense of people not being prepared for what might happen at death or at birth, in part because the hospitals themselves have gone through so much transformation the past 2 months. It's almost it's kind of unbelievable how much hospitals have changed in the last 2 months, and how much the role of both birth and death doulas and midwives and funeral directors has changed as hospitals have changed, and as society's relationship to death has shifted, and with that the relationship to birth has shifted. And it's all part of this sort of similar, it's all part of the sort of same health, not just a healthcare system, because in some ways that that phrase really undermines and does not capture what the depth of what we're talking about here. But the mystery of what does it mean to be human together on this planet has shifted during this moment. And I'm just wondering if, as people are now dying alone, or the hospitals have become unsafe for either birth or death, for many people they seem to be unsafe. And at least if they're not unsafe, that's certainly isolating. Right now, hospitals are more isolating than they've been maybe ever in my lifetime. What are you telling people, and what kinds of questions are people asking you, and how are you able to help guide people at this moment as they are facing greater levels of isolation and as they're struggling to figure out what is their relationship to birth and death at home? And how are you guys changing how you're thinking about it? I know it's a huge question to be asking, but let's see what we can do before we end.
I think one concern that comes up for me is that I don't want to reproduce the kinds of anxieties that emerge in those spaces. Mm-hmm. And so I worry that wearing a mask and wearing gloves, distancing myself, threatens to actually mask the different kind of care, the different model of care. And so I try to be really deliberate in sort of unmasking the care while protecting myself and protecting them.
Can you say a little bit about what that means? What do you mean?
Yeah, I think, well, in particular, following the basic kinds of safety protocols, but, I haven't been in this situation yet where I've had a client who has had symptoms of the virus in labor, in which case they would have to transfer because I can't adequately protect myself or my second midwife who attends births with me, which means that I can't adequately protect the people that I serve or my family or their families or their communities. And so, but I also feel a lot of grief in not being able to serve somebody in that way and knowingly sending them into an environment where they're going to have what they don't want, which is, of course, that's always a possibility with birth. There's always a possibility that somebody will need to transfer into for medical care. And, I'm glad to have it. I'm glad to have it when we need it. Absolutely. But it's, there's definitely a mourning process around that. And then I think, the other piece to it is just my shifting relationship with my clients and feeling like, for me, I have a lot of sadness that comes up around viewing my clients as contagious or not necessarily contagious, but potentially contagious. So that, suddenly the bodies of the people that I care about so dearly are, potentially dangerous. And so I don't like seeing my clients that way, or I don't like to have to assess them in that way, because in the past, anytime I'm assessing risk is not about risk to me. It's risk to, how is the baby doing? How is the parent doing? Not about how I'm doing or how my family is doing, what I could potentially be bringing home, how, the client that I have to see the next day or the baby that I have to see the next day is going to be. So, that just feels really awful.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to compromise anything about how I care for the families that I work with.
And that's the biggest challenge, because it changes. So how do we change without compromising? And for me, it's I really, and we talked about this, was really struggling with it. Okay, when do I start masking? And I think part of it is I can choose how I then, right, because it's seeing people as contagious, it's seeing bodies as dangerous things. I mean, right, where it takes the humanness away from them and creates more of an object sense of them, and that is absolutely the last thing that I want to do. But I could maybe decide not to wear a mask because I can go and I can come home, but then my husband, who is primarily responsible, he's being able to online teach, and so we're here together. What am I bringing home to him? We can't do everything. We can't have everything delivered to our doorstep. We're going out into the community. What are we bringing to the grocery store? I don't go to the grocery store, but Paul does. And so it's just like these layers of choice. So what I've started to try and change my relationship to it, in thinking about it as this is a boundary that's an act of love. My way of loving myself, of loving the people that I'm working with, of loving the community that I'm a part of, and extending that love through those communities is to wear a mask, is to wear gloves, is to touch less, is to take more distance, is to, if you cannot come into my place of business and sit down across a table and make arrangements with me, but can we do it over Skype, over the phone? Can I fax you documents? These are acts of love. I don't quite believe it yet, because setting a new boundary is always hard. But I know that it is, that's where it's coming from. It is coming from this profound sense of, and this comes back to acknowledging my existence as somebody who lives in community, even with people that I don't know. I live in community with people that I don't know, and what I can do for that community is to protect myself. And the reality is that, it's the virus that's dangerous. It's not people. And so trying to find ways to kind of come into better relationship with that boundary, and that act as an act of love. And then the other thing too is to help families when we talk about kind of unmasking the care. For me, working as a funeral director with families and developing these sort of these rituals for mourning is what does it mean? So, why do we need to be seen? Why do we need to be held in community? And then how can we recreate that once we kind of better understand what the need is? And if we know that everybody is going to be lighting a candle at a certain time and reading this poem together, if carrying that knowledge and kind of empowering the sense of ourselves of that mental connectedness and the emotional connectedness that we share, that I think often gets lost. And I think has particularly been lost as the internet's made it easier for us to stay connected in different ways. But, we used to stay connected through letter writing. And the physical act of writing a letter and the physical act of receiving and reading a letter used to be this very profound sense of connection, that doesn't need to be undervalued just because you can pick up the phone or call somebody, or, so to me, looking at it's about receiving those words from others. So how does that reception, how does that transmission happen? So those are kind of the two things that I've been working with is how do I come up with this new relationship of the way that I am physically dressed and masked, and when I'm interacting with bodies or with families is an act of love for my community. And then also how do people receive what it is that they need out of person, by really understanding what that need is. I don't know that there are easy solutions, but those are the mindsets that I'm trying to put myself in when I'm contemplating those things.
I love what you're saying about this possibility of bringing, not only relying upon online spaces to have these conversations and to have these rituals, but finding other ways of doing it, even if it's letter writing or finding some form of engaging with the material world as somatic beings, as really critical. I think that we need to, in some ways, expand beyond our understanding of what's possible online, to find other ways of incorporating the somatic material world. I'm looking out the window as I say that, into these experiences, so that it's not simply like a look. And I say that as someone who I think I actually do a very, very good job of creating profound spaces online, and I still feel that the importance of cultivating safe ways of doing things outside of enabling the mystery to move between us in new ways. And I'm very curious to see what you guys both develop in the coming weeks to come. And I also just really want to acknowledge that yes, these new boundaries are forms of love. And I hear, and what both of you guys are saying, I hear the extent to which it is causing you tremendous grief to erect these boundaries at all, and to have masks at all, to not be able to touch the people who come to you for support, and how hard that is. And I think it's really important to not step over that. There's been a little bit of a rush to say, oh, this is about being loving to the community. There's been a little bit of a rush to say that too quickly sometimes, and not to acknowledge how much so many of us are deeply missing physical touch. And as a healer who does work both online and offline, it's like physically painful for me to not be touching the people who I want to be touching, right? And who come to me for help. And I can do great stuff. I've had people had profound experiences with me online, and I'm still, even with that knowledge, I feel like I'm chomping at a bit that I did not want to have put in my mouth. And I want to just acknowledge for both of you guys that that's true, and acknowledge how much probably many of the nurses and doctors really miss you. And really miss having someone else in the room to support with this process, even though they're doing as much as they possibly can. Some with more knowledge and awareness, some with less, but they're doing as much as they can. I'm sure that many of them miss your presence as well. We're kind of come to the end of our time here, and I'm just wondering, give you both a chance to kind of speak to what you feel needs to be said as we end this conversation together. And so many questions have arisen. This issue of life and death is not going away anytime soon. So there are possibilities of continuing variations of this conversation in the future.
I just want to acknowledge, I think we both work in many ways outside of the system, but just acknowledging the trauma that people who are providers, practitioners inside of the system are experiencing, because I think that they are also struggling with this absence of touch, or being perceived in different ways, or having to erect these new kinds of boundaries and protocols. And just I think that the trauma of this moment, there's a lot of beauty in this moment, but we are going to be excavating the trauma for many, many years. For people at all levels of the system, moving through the system. Yeah, I think we're all just kind of doing our best right now to stay in it and continue to be present, and serve the people that we serve in the best way possible, and care for ourselves and our families in the best way possible. So just acknowledging that. And I think I feel like a lot of these conversations end with like, and what do you hope for, where this could go? And I think that from this place of empathy and compassion for providers who have, I think for a long time, had a very antagonistic view of the kind of work that I do. What I sincerely hope is that we have like mutual respect and better collaboration and integration, and that doesn't necessarily have to look like a formalized kind of integration, but certainly to acknowledge that right now there are midwives who are caring for people who are keeping their bodies outside of the hospitals, and who are not, who are staying safe and working to keep other people safe, and who are low risk and staying out of higher risk spaces. So like, that's a beautiful thing. And I feel in a way that even though it's in a sense like intangible, like we're not doing it with intention. We're not collaborating with doctors and saying like, okay, I'm going to take care of this person here, and you're going to take care of this person here. Like that's what's happening. So, my hope is that we end up with greater acceptance of the kind of work that, certainly the kind of work that I do, and of course the kind of work that Michelle does, but that it becomes more normal to seek healthcare outside of these conventional medical frameworks. and to seek personalized care, in-home care, care that acknowledges all of who somebody is, care that takes time, care that sits in that intimate and vulnerable space. How wonderful would it be if that became more normal, if that became conventional?
I think, again, times of great uncertainty, right? The possible is infinite. And it's easy to lose sight of that because it's terrifying to be in times of great uncertainty. And yeah, a lot of what I'm looking at, for me, is looking out at the community and asking the community, to start having these conversations. Again, to create that same sort of, it doesn't need to be a formal integration, but just to look at, these are things that are possible, that aren't wrong. Like it's not about good, bad, better, best, right, wrong. Everybody has the ability to make the best decision for themselves, and we don't need to be choosing out of fear, and we don't need to be choosing out of limited options. Again, the possibilities are infinite. And so if we can start having real honest conversations, like actually talking about death, like actually talking about what dying is, actually talking about the fact that, like, we are mortal beings. We've come into the world, that we go through these transitions, and that life gives us so many opportunities to practice with loss. Like right now is this extreme possibility to practice with loss, but to turn that into deeper conversations about what is human, which is to be mortal, to be born, to die, and what does it mean to be supported through those transitions, and to take, I think I was using the metaphor, Krystina, when we were talking the other day about, like, in some ways this is revealing kind of how dark the shadows are in terms of conventional practice versus what we do if we look at ourselves as lights, but also to look for where those lights are in conventional practice, and how do we kind of bring those lights closer together, so that the shadows aren't as dark, because ultimately the hope is that anybody that's working in any type of care for humans is there because they care about humans. And so if we can kind of stay in this level of, we're all trying to take care of people, and how do we do this better? I know I just said we don't use better or best, but how do we work together? I guess not better. How do we work together? And how do we make space for all the ways that we can support humans? And how do we empower people to ask for ways to be supported in the ways that they are human? That's sort of what I would really like to see. And I think it's possible. I do. I really do.
It's a time for, but I mean, part this sort of, I think many people have said this before, that, and you guys have both said it, that the revelation of the moment of how things are breaking down, and the places where the system has always had challenges, right? And certainly that is one of the places that's most apparent right now, is in the level of racism that is very clear in the system right now. And that's clear in terms of say, for example, the number of both Black and Latino people who are dying at a much higher percentage rate than their white counterparts. And those numbers are almost all probably inaccurate because of fear of the health system, particularly within the Latino, but also the Black community, for good reason. And so that as we can, and that on the flip side, towards what you guys are both saying, the possibility of these enabling cross-cultural and cross-ethnic conversations around alternatives is profound, and that's true in all these different systems that you're talking about. And I hear both of you guys working towards that in beautiful ways, and that this is a time of moving from a predisposed plan into greater levels of anticipation, which is an incredibly rich opportunity. So if people want to get in touch with you, what are the best ways for them to do so? I'm going to put it in the notes of the show so that people can see it written down, but can you just both say how is the best way to get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you and learn more about your work or be in touch with you for whatever reason?
Um, so email is the best way. I laugh just because it comes with a plea for patience. Especially right now, that sense of overwhelm comes, like, sometimes it's really hard for me to, like, open my email and, and respond. But, like, I really value when people reach out and communicate and ask questions. And so, when my business is a little bit on hiatus, but it's still there. So my business is called Ending Well. And my email address is michelle@ending-well.com. So that's just, it's easy. And I know that writing emails isn't the easiest way always for all people to communicate. But even if it's just like a couple words or a phone number or something like that, I do really try to respond and create connections, or put people in touch with people that are maybe a little bit, have more emotional bandwidth than I might have, or maybe better equipped to have specific conversations that people are asking to have. So people should always feel free to reach out via email. But just, yes, with the plea for a little bit of patience, that I can't respond like immediately to everybody on a given day. That's sometimes a little bit of self-care that I give myself, is to just not do that. So.
Sounds very wise, and I'm sure that many people would do well to follow that if they're not already.
Yeah, and for me, the best way is to reach out through my website. So my practice is called barakabirth.com, which is BARAKABIRTH.com. And there's a kind of form contact letter on there that people can use to reach out to me, and that goes to my email.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been incredibly, incredibly rich, and I am looking forward to seeing where things flow and possibly having a further conversation in the future.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So wonderful to see you both.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.